Chance, good evening, everyone. My name is Jarrett Martineau. I'm the head curator here at the Chan Center for the Performing Arts. I'm Nechio and Dennis Suthane from Frog Lake Cree Nation in Alberta. And first, I just want to welcome you all here tonight to this incredible evening's event, and also to the unceded and ancestral homelands of the Musqueam people. And I want to raise my hands and extend my thanks and gratitude to the Musqueam for their ongoing caretaking of these beautiful, beautiful lands, especially beautiful on a day like today. I'm so happy that you're all here this evening. My remarks will be brief. We have a ton of incredible speakers, as I'm sure you know, for this evening's event. And I just want to say that I'm very grateful that an event like this is happening here at the Chan Center. As you probably know, we do a lot of music programming and other performance-based programming here at the Chan Center. And I think staging opportunities like this for public convenings and dialogues and gathering and important conversations about topics of our time, this is so much a part of what we do. And so I'm so thrilled that an event like this is happening tonight. And I want to thank the team at the Vancouver Writers Festival, at the UB Center for Climate Justice, for their partnership on this event. And I hope you all come back again soon for more of our incredible programming. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to the wonderful and brilliant Carol Liao, the co-director of the Center for Climate Justice. Enjoy yourselves this evening.
Thank you, Jarrett. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. As Jarrett said, my name is Carol Liao, and I'm an associate professor of law at UBC. I'm also the co-director with Naomi Klein at the UBC Center for Climate Justice. I am so honored to welcome you tonight to this very special event where we're going to engage this full house at the Chan Center in some much-needed, thought-provoking conversation as we try to make sense of this dizzying moment in our history. But before I begin, I also want to first acknowledge that we are gathered here tonight on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam peoples. And we stand firm in the condemnation of efforts to prevent our university from acknowledging that fact. For countless generations, these unceded lands of the Musqueam have been a place for learning, connection, and stewardship. And we're grateful to be gathered here as we commit to work towards repair, reconciliation, and resistance to attacks on Indigenous peoples and their rights. This event, hosted by the UBC Center for Climate Justice, would not be possible without our co-hosts and dear friends here at the Chan Center for Performing Arts and the Vancouver Writers Fest. It has been a true collaboration among our three organizations, with proceeds from tonight going towards free programming throughout the year. The UBC Center for Climate Justice was created 4 years ago in response to student demand and is a place of mobilization. We connect critical research with communities to address the harms and disproportionate impacts of climate change on our societies. And our hope tonight is to bring more awareness to the work we do in education, connection, and engagement. We're grateful for your support. We will happily take donations via the Center for Climate Justice website to ensure we are able to continue that work. Thank you, as always, to our supporters and donors who help us make a difference. Tonight is also a celebration of books. Books, ideas, dialogue, and I want to give a shout out to the Vancouver Writers Fest and their annual festival, which takes place this October on Granville Island and is always igniting our city and our passion for words in the world around us. And our deepest thanks to our friends here at the Chan Center and Jarrett for their continued work in amplifying the arts and artists, which is now more important than ever. Just a quick note about the shape of the event here tonight. The latter part of the evening, you as the audience will have the opportunity to ask questions. You'll see the QR code on the screen that can allow you to submit questions over Slido and upvote, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. And just a kind reminder to please remember to silence your phones. And following our event, our three guests will be in the main hall to sign copies of their books. And we're grateful to our bookseller this evening, Upstart and Crow, who have plenty of copies for sale. So let me begin by introducing our moderator for tonight. Elamin Abdelmahmoud is a celebrated writer, broadcaster, one of the most beloved media personalities and cultural commentators of his generation. You may know Elamin as the host of CBC Radio's Commotion, where he brings vibrant, thoughtful energy to the world of pop culture and current affairs. Born in Sudan and raised in Ontario, Elamin's critically acclaimed national bestseller and New York Times Notable Book of the Year, Son of Elsewhere, A Memoir in Pieces, is a powerful reflection on Blackness, belonging, and the challenges and rewards of finding your way in the world. Whether he's on the airwaves, on the page, on the stage, Elamin's voice is one that challenges, connects, and inspires, and we're so glad to have him here tonight to moderate this rich conversation. Which brings us to Seth Klein, a true champion for justice, equity, poverty reduction, and bold climate action, along with being Naomi's big brother. Seth is a respected policy expert, author, and dedicated advocate for transformative change. He has spent decades pushing the boundaries of what's possible in the fight for a fairer, greener future. Seth served for 22 years as the founding director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives in BC, and has now helped launch the BC Society for Policy Solutions, a social justice think tank, and is the team lead and director of strategy with the Climate Emergency Unit. He is the author of the book, A Good War, which reimagines how we tackle the climate crisis with the urgency and ambition of wartime mobilization. Written over 4 years ago, it's become a timely and timeless work as we grapple with these newfound challenges of the day. And last, but certainly not least, it is a true privilege to introduce Naomi Klein, award-winning journalist, globally renowned and best-selling author, filmmaker, co-director of the Center for Climate Justice, and one of the most influential public intellectuals of our time. Her 9 New York Times best-selling books, from No Logo to This Changes Everything and Doppelganger, has been translated into over 35 languages and have sold millions of copies around the world. Her books have been groundbreaking in helping to shape how we understand capitalism, crisis, and climate. And now, incredibly, her book, The Shock Doctrine, written almost 20 years ago, is back on bestseller lists as we witness these shock and awe tactics that are reverberating around us. From front lines of disaster zones to the halls of power, from Standing Rock to the Vatican, Naomi has spoken truth to power time and again, with clarity and a relentless commitment to justice. Her ideas have galvanized social movements across the globe, and she's earned recognition from Time Magazine, The New Yorker, The Guardian, as one of the most influential voices of the 21st century. Whether through her trailblazing journalism, her award-winning documentaries, or her visionary organizing, Naomi invites us to imagine a radically fairer world and dares us to build it. We are so excited to share this evening with you tonight. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming to the stage Elamin, Seth, and Naomi.
You guys can keep clapping if you want. I don't. Come on, how lucky are we to be here? This is a tremendous turnout, tremendous evening. I've been really looking forward to this conversation with both of you. First, let me just say, I host a radio show for a living, so it means I don't get out much. So this is just nice for me. Can I just, before we dive into the questions, I wanted to tell you guys and tell the audience here that the 3 things that I'm hoping to accomplish with this conversation. So first I want to sort of root us in the reality of shock doctrine and this idea of the ways that shock can be used in different ways and manipulated in different ways. And you might call that the diagnosis. And then I want to maybe turn to our political imagination and the thing that keeps it small and the thing that prevents it from expanding, the things that prevents us from believing that we can actually do a lot of things in this country. And you might call that the treatment plan, and then how do you move beyond shock to what comes after that? And you might call that the recovery. And I think if you're following the metaphor, it means you know that I'm not a doctor, But let me start, Naomi, with just acknowledging that if someone was born the day that the Shock Doctrine came out, on Monday would be their first federal election they could vote. Okay? So just to orient us here. This is a book about the scaling of exploitation. We know that people who are in shock and in crisis can be convinced of a lot of things and sometimes manipulated in directions they don't necessarily want to go in the middle of the rupture, in the middle of the confusion. Do you want to talk about the thesis of the shock doctrine in this moment?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Hi. Thanks for nerding out with us on a beautiful Saturday night in Vancouver. We weren't sure. We wanted to do this event, and the only time the Chan was available in this time period was a Saturday night, and we're like, will people come out on a Saturday night? We didn't know that the federal election would be 2 days later. So thank you all for sharing this evening with us. We really appreciate it.
They came.
Yay! Sold out. And thank you for coming to be with us. I've been a fan for so long.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. This has been a tremendous honor.
We're Twitter friends when I was on Twitter. Yeah. Hey, Seth.
Hey, no. First of all, the first event they've done on stage ever, so come on.
Welcome to our nepotism, but honestly, I really did, when I thought about who I wanted to have this conversation with, Seth was the top of my list because, I wrote a book more recently that came out in 2017 called No Is Not Enough, Resisting Trump's Shock Politics. And the thesis of that book was that we will not win just by rejection. We have to propose. And that's what Seth's brilliant book, A Good War, is all about. It's about unlocking that sense of the possible. So Seth, thank you so much for doing this with me. Thank you, Carol, for that beautiful introduction. Everybody at the CCJ and the Vancouver Writers Festival, Jarrett and the whole amazing team at the Chan who brings so much brilliance to our city. We're so blessed. The Shock Doctrine. I became interested in shock as a political strategy to avoid democracy after September 11th. I had been part of a movement that some of you in this room may remember. We were a movement that was taking on corporate free trade. We were in the streets in 1999 in Seattle in 2000. Right before September 11th, there were I think 300,000 people in the streets of Genoa at a G8 summit, and it was really taking on corporate power. It was trying to understand, how did the system get so rigged? And after September 11th, in addition to all the things that we know that are well known about how that shock was harnessed to invade countries that had nothing to do with the shock, about how we had things like the Patriot Act and civil liberties came under attack, how huge parts of the US government at that stage were privatized, including the military. So we saw more and more private contractors like Blackwater. The other thing that happened is that this movement of ours got kind of blasted out of the discussion. It was like everything, there was this phrase after September 11th, when you would like raise a critique, people would say, that's pre-9/11 thinking. And it was this idea that nothing you knew before the shock even mattered. You were a blank slate. In fact, the working title of the Shock Doctrine was "Blank is Beautiful." So basically, the Shock Doctrine is a democracy avoidance tactic, and it is a theory of power that uses states of shock and crisis and the disorientation and dislocation that occurs when people experience an event that they don't yet have a story to explain. So 9/11, for many people in North America, not just in the United States, seemed like a bolt from the blue. Now, it didn't come from nowhere, it came from somewhere, and the impulse that a lot of people shared in that moment was to find out where it came from. They had a healthy impulse to learn history, to put the event in time and space. But that was the experience. It was like, where did this come from, right? And so the Bush administration very quickly used that, exacerbated that state of shock to push through this pre-existing agenda. Like there were people in the Bush administration that had wanted to invade Iraq for a very long time. Originally I thought it was going to be a book just about Iraq. I reported from Baghdad, and what I was reporting on was the way the US government was using the shock and awe, as it was called, invasion of Iraq, to impose economic shock therapy, rapid fire privatization, deregulation, attacks on labor. So I was covering the economic front of the war. But then as I dug into it, I saw that this pattern had been used again and again to impose what we call neoliberalism. So the Shock Doctrine is really an alternative history of how we ended up with what is sometimes called neoliberalism, some people call market fundamentalism, but this sort of extreme form of capitalism that we've all been living with, told through shocks. So it starts in Chile and it goes all the way through to Hurricane Katrina. But there's a quote that I made famous through that book, which is by Milton Friedman, the late free market economist, who said, "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change." When a crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to keep the ideas ready until to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable. That is, I think, what a lot of right-wing think tanks exist to do, and sort of chambers of commerce and so on, is to hoard these ideas for when the shock comes, and then you can move very, very quickly. Seth and his work with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives and other progressive think tanks have been trying to counter this by having our own ideas lying around, but we'll come to that. That's what the Shock Doctrine is. It's a democracy avoidance strategy that takes advantage of our fear, our dislocation, our disorientation, when we experience not just something bad, but something bad that is happening for which we do not yet have a story. So this is really key, because I think Trump's threats to annex Canada, to turn it into the 51st state, is not necessarily what we expected. It's not what he did the first time, right? This is our largest trading partner. It's frightening. I want to acknowledge that it's frightening, and it should be frightening, right? I mean, I think that this wakes up historical memories, including historical memories of this country being invaded, because this is a colonial nation that is on stolen indigenous land. That's more than just an acknowledgement that we make at the beginning of events. It's true, right? So that's the moment that we're in, and we've got a lot of people trying to take advantage of it.
Well, so first of all, that's a cheery start.
I mean, you came here. So.
Well, I was going to say that, I think the reason we can fill this hall on a beautiful Saturday night is because people are in shock. I think that people are in shock for various reasons. I think the last few months, particularly since Trump's election, have been a series of shocks. And I just want to talk a little bit about the fact that while we are having this conversation and the federal election is happening on Monday, I've been really struck by the ways that some political conventions, some political norms have just been completely upended very quietly. I mean, I don't know if you guys heard, but you may have seen the Quebec Premier, François Legault, talking about how Quebec might be a bit more amenable to pipelines. I think if you've been following Canadian politics for the last 20 years, that's a big surprise. Like, that's a really significant turn. And for it to have happened that quickly feels like it's in conversation with the Shock Doctrine, which is to say, like, oh, we are in a moment of crisis, we are in a moment of uncertainty, and that opens up certain doors. So how do you see the Shock Doctrine playing out in this federal election?
Right. So I think we've got the shock to the South, right, that is being reacted to here, and we might think of that as like a sub-shock doctrine or a CanCon shock doctrine, where we have our own players, right, our own oligarchs who are ready and waiting with their ideas lying around. So yeah, all of a sudden there is this assumption, like we are finding out again that we have a very undiversified economy, right? We have found this out again and again because we are very dependent on a few commodities. And we've been on this commodity roller coaster. So the price of oil suddenly shoots up and there's a boom in the tar sands. It drops, thousands and thousands of people lose their jobs, right? But we also are very, very dependent on this one trading partner. So we need a more diversified economy. That seems to have been metabolized by a lot of very powerful people across this country as we need a lot more pipelines, right? And I don't know exactly how to explain it, except that saying, like, when you're in a hole, stop digging? I think they may have misunderstood it or misheard, and they think it's like when you're in a hole, dig as many more new holes as you possibly can. Some holes for bitumen, holes for fracked gas, holes for pipelines to carry it, some cobalt to lithium, copper, turn this country into Swiss cheese. That is clearly the only solution. No, it's not. But so things moved very quickly, right? The problem is that we haven't homogenized our regulation, so we need a race to the bottom across provincial boundaries. The wish list was ready to go, and it is, it's worth remembering that in the U.S. we have thousands and thousands of people coming together in stadiums, many more than here, to see AOC and Bernie in their Fight Oligarchy tour. They understand that what they're up against is not just Donald Trump and not just the Republicans, it's like a corporate coup d'etat. They are up against oligarchy. We are too. And we don't fight their oligarchy by giving our oligarchs absolutely everything that they want. And if you take one message...
So pipelines, that's like my trigger word, so I have to weigh in. But first of all, let me also just say thank you all for coming, and gratitude to be here on these unceded lands of the Musqueam people. And it's a real joy to be here with my sister doing this. And want to acknowledge our families here. Our parents are here, just to know. And my wife, Christine, is here, and our kids, Zoe and Aaron, are here. And thank you, Elamin, for being here. But pipelines, it feels, so at one level, it's not, the speed of that opportunism is both unsurprising and yet still obscene. Pipelines, it's almost like they're this, to me, they're this national symbol of our denialism. Like we're addicts constantly bargaining, like, please, just one more, and then we'll go straight. And if you're the Liberals, you're like, just give us this one more pipeline, and we promise to use the money to fund the transition. But there is part of this narrative that Naomi just spoke to, this idea that, well, if we can get more pipelines east and west and north, we'll diversify our markets. Pipelines and LNG aren't about getting us out from under the thumb of the US. They put us further into bed with the elephant. It's not just that these companies that are driving this are mostly American. They are some of Donald Trump's biggest allies and bagmen. Whether it's the CEO of KKR, which is the major owner of the Coastal GasLink pipeline, or Blackstone, or Apollo, which is the main money behind Silism's LNG and the PRGT pipeline. These are some of Donald Trump's largest donors and allies. And this is the last moment at which we should be rewarding them. I mean, it would be akin to choosing this moment to sign some new contract with Tesla or Starlink. It makes zero sense. But also just the logic of the pitch that we're getting, right? It takes a long time to build a pipeline. Even if we get a government that is insistent on permitting this thing as fast as they possibly can, it's complex. You got to get assessments. There's going to be indigenous opposition, and they face extreme weather, ironically. I mean, one of the reasons why the TMX pipeline took so long is because of the atmospheric river and the flooding and the fires that slowed down a lot of that. So even when these things happen, by the time they are done, Donald Trump is assuredly not going to be the president, and he very well may have taken up residence in the fiery pits of hell. But they're warming up. But the tragedy of it is that this should be a moment, it's an opening to choose a different path. That's what Europe did when, in the face of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, is they catapulted forward on that transition off of fossil fuels and off of gas. And progressive leaders should be seizing on a moment like this to catapult us into the new.
Okay, a lot there. First of all, I've never met siblings who both have pipeline jokes. That's new to me. But here's the natural pushback: is a threat is still a threat, right? Which is to say, that's not to say the shock goes away, right? The shock is still the shock in that moment, and so in this case, the threat of Donald Trump, I mean, it's not a theoretical threat. He repeated on Friday, right? Time magazine interviewed him, and they said, "Are you trolling about this 51st state stuff?" And he was like, "No, I really mean it." And which is to say,
I think he really means it.
I do. I agree with you. I think he means. I think that's why he keeps repeating it. And
even if he doesn't actually want to take over the country, he wants our resources. He wants the Great Lakes. He wants our critical minerals. He wants it all, right? But we shouldn't pillage ourselves before he gets a chance like that. But anyway, yeah, you were gonna say.
No, which is
I have
to say
so
that,
many pipeline jokes. Yeah.
Are there more? No, but which is to say, in a moment like this one, we've somehow ended up in an election where it's two front sort of parties trying to compete, in terms of being I can build a pipeline way faster than you. I think that is kind of a through line of this election. But they're also responding to a threat, and they sort of want to be seen responding to a threat. Right. And part of that functions as a part of the shock, but part of that functions as a part of the threat's a threat.
The threat is real. And there's a part of me that is really moved by all of the elbows up and the Canadian flags. And what I worry is the flag acting as a kind of a weighted blanket or like a sedative, right? Where we forget why we opposed the pipelines in the first place, right? There were really good reasons for it. They violated Indigenous land rights. They still do. And they're talking about fast-tracking and violating UNDRIP and violating all of these commitments and pretending like the climate emergency is not happening. And that's what I mean about this logic of forget everything you knew before the shock. None of that matters. It's the opposite. We need to get oriented, right? We need to get oriented, and how we get oriented is remembering what we know. So I'm scared. I don't want to join the United States. I'm really happy. I moved back from the U.S. Because I like it here. It's not perfect, But I think we should really think about what is it that we're afraid of? Because in some ways, Donald Trump is right. It's just a line on a map. Most of us speak the same language. We have a lot of things in common. But there are some things that make us different that I don't want to lose, that make me proud, because not, in some sort of nationalist way, but because these are things that our movement ancestors fought for and won, And our policies are an expression of our values. And so I want to get really nerdy with all of you who want to spend a Saturday night here. And I want to ask you, I asked Elamin permission for if I could do this, but maybe you can help me out here. Like, just when you think about why you don't want to be the 51st state, what is it that you're afraid of losing? What is it about being Canadian that you want more of, that is important to you? Just like, okay, the obvious one, public health care, universal public health care. Okay, I'm starting. What? Gay rights.
Gay rights,
okay.
yeah.
What?
Guns.
Fewer guns. Okay. In this.
Humanity.
Education. What? Disability rights. What? Diverse. The CBC.
That gets the applause. Can I rip
Yeah,
off?
yeah, you can
$20
that.
later.
Well, so those are great. And this is sort of personal for us. So our parents were American, our parents who are here. And our parents actually came to Canada twice. They immigrated twice. Once under duress, and then a second time by choice. But in all cases, even though, as Naomi says, like there's lots that we just are very similar between Canada and the United States, and yet there are these differences. So the first time they came, when my mother was pregnant with me, and my dad had his induction notice during the Vietnam War, and they came as war resistors, which was a war that we were not directly involved in. And then they moved back to the States for a time, and then came back again, drawn back the second time by Medicare and the National Film Board. These two institutions, flawed as they are, but that fundamentally distinguish us from the United States, and they sort of drive home for us that there actually are real differences that matter.
I want you to go a little bit deeper into that, the idea that having something like the National Film Board is a draw to this country, because what you're talking about is public institutions that care about preserving a culture, or care about preserving a sense of place.
That are important to culture, and that are institutions. Maybe let me come back to your earlier point. So the threat is real, and we're right to be worried. And I actually think for some of our leaders, you could sort of sense it in the early weeks when Trump first started with the tariff threats in the 51st state business. It felt like they were a little panicked, and which is understandable. All shocks, you got to give people a little space for a bit of disorientation when a shock first hit. So that's part of the book. But in that panicked response, the policymakers sort of default to these well-worn solutions to everything. So they default to austerity, oh, we're going to have to be careful with the budget, and they default to speed up permitting for major resource projects, and they default to tax cuts, because tax cuts are the answer to everything. And yet all three of those are precisely the wrong answer, and sort of speak to a failure of imagination. I think we'll come back to that. But they also occur in a context in which we have forgotten how to create institutions when we need them.
But if I can just pick up on some of what people shared, and I think we could go on. I mean, we have traditions of multilateralism in this country. Canadians played key roles in drafting the Declaration of Human Rights, right? And it's a patchy record. All of it is patchy. All of it was fought, was resisted, pushed. Half measures won, right? We got universal health care. It didn't cover all kinds of parts of our bodies, right? But what's striking to me is that so many of the things on that list, right? Public education, public health care, the CBC, they're embattled, right? And we've been attacking ourselves without anybody's help, without the U.S. invading us. We have been allowing the very things that make us most proud as Canadians to erode. We've been backing the U.S. on all kinds of imperial military adventures. We have been allowing our police to become more militarized. We have been starving the CBC and public health care and allowing it to be more privatized. We've been allowing our universities to become more corporatized, less accessible. So the point of asking what is it that we're afraid of losing, the reason why I ask that question is because I think that offers us some real hints of how we fight back, what we lean into. If we don't want to become the United States, let's be less like them in how we fight, right? Let's think about investing. Like instead of just more pipelines, we could be investing in care, in culture, in education. We could, there could be a huge brain gain in this country if we had doubled our support for post-secondary education. And also, by the way, as Seth was saying, our parents came here as war resistors. And my dad got straight into McGill as a deserter to the U.S. military. He was wanted by the U.S. military, and McGill let him in. Our universities should be opening their doors right now to the international scholars who are being deported for for speaking out against genocide, which is all of our duty.
I think, of course, I think the thing that connects the two things you guys are talking about here is the drive in this country for us to continue to remind ourselves that we are different from the United States in the middle of the shock, and then fighting to figure out what are the things that make us different, fighting to figure out, sort of begin to articulate that. And what I've been noticing happening in the middle of the shock is this idea of giving people space. That thing is not really happening. We really are in it all the time, and we're in it all the time, and it's impossible not to react as things sort of keep happening. You watch the news in the United States and you say, oh my God, they're doing this, and also the annexation threats continue. And I want to just root this a little bit in the psychological for just a moment, because I think one through line between Shock Doctrine and your most recent book, Doppelganger, which I've told you is, I truly think is one of the best books written in the last decade. I'm just really grateful for that book. Yeah, of course. And to me, the through line between the two of them is that they're tangling with and wrestling with the psychological and the psychosocial. You don't begin the Shock Doctrine with a thesis. You begin by saying, this is how psychological experiments were done in collusion with the CIA. You begin Doppelganger by saying, we are very sort of psychologically cued, shall we say, to react to ideas that happen in the mirror world. Something breaks off, and we kind of recognize something in that, even though it might look a little bit off to us. Do you begin your analysis with sort of ideas and then zoom into the mind, or do you kind of begin in the mind and kind of zoom out? Where do you start?
I think that psychological piece is really, really interesting to me. In part because I observe it in myself. I don't put myself apart from any of this. I have felt those very things of maybe we can just trust these sort of father figure, banker daddy, save us, I feel it in myself. And so it makes me curious. And I guess, as someone, I'm not that much of a wonk. I'm looking at Seth because he really is. It's those stories that really that really interest me. And I was thinking, it's funny you should mention Doppelganger, because as I was thinking about tonight, I was like, you know what? What Doppelganger taught me is that our doubles that we're so kind of repulsed by are holding up a mirror to us. Everything that we don't want to be like in the U.S. is already here. We are that. Of course, we have guns. Of course, we have a brutal and bloody history of colonization. We are founded on stolen land. If we don't want it to be like them, we can choose to be different, right? And there was a reckoning that was really happening in this country, where we were interrogating what was behind the flag. We were interrogating that nationalism. And I hope we cannot abandon that process in the name of fighting this double to the south, right? Because if it's holding up a mirror, and we have a choice, I think the best way that we can fight them is becoming less like them, and that means being less nationalist, okay? And more internationalist. The whole world is terrified of Trump, right? How about if we really made common cause with Panama, with indigenous people in Greenland, who want autonomy and also not to be taken over by the United States, want autonomy from Denmark? Why is it assumed that our primary allies are in Europe, right? Why not in our hemisphere? I'm interested in that sort of projection of everything that we don't like about ourselves onto the United States, right? I think we're entangled, but it's showing us something important about choices that we can make.
Can I embarrass my sister for a second? Because in your question about the psychology of this moment, I think your question speaks to why people read Naomi. We live in very disorienting, chaotic times, right? Everyone's feeling it, that the world feels like chaos. And I think, we all know lots of smart people in our lives, but we interact with very few brilliant people. And the brilliant people are the pattern seers. I remember editing the Shock Doctrine 20 years ago, and I remember I kept putting it down and saying, I knew most of this stuff, but I've never seen the dots connected this way. I don't know if any of you had that reaction. And that's Naomi's gift, is in a world where everything feels so chaotic, to unearth the patterns and to find the patterns in the chaos. I think that's why we read you.
I was just thinking, Seth has always been one of my very first readers, and sorry if this is getting a little bit personal, but, when I was Seth was always a really great student. I was a very selectively good student, and a very selectively absent student. And I had a history class when I was in 10th grade, and one of the subjects that we had to write our final essay, we had a series of possible topics, and one of them was America, policeman to the world, ? And I was like, what does that even mean? And I asked Seth what that meant and what I should write about. And he said, go to the library and ask about Chile and Allende. I was like, I had no idea what he was talking about. And I went, and it was like my very first use of a library. And it was like when they were still, I used to just go smoke cigarettes at the library. But it turns out there were books there. And
Many of them.
Anyway, I keep going like this because this was still when they were, cataloged, and they brought me a stack of Time magazines from 1973, and it blew my mind. And so that, I think, not only did you know it, you taught me about it
I
too.
didn't know that, but that's why I'm your sector weapon. If you have an early edition of the Shock Doctrine, there's a typo in it. Having read the manuscript when the book finally came out, you do what everyone does. You go and look at the acknowledgments and see what the author said about you. And I went and looked, and it's like, thanks to my brother, my sector weapon. And I'm like, what the hell does that even mean? And it was a typo.
Yeah.
It was a typo.
You're the
It
sector
meant
weapon, man.
it was
You just
supposed to be
ruined it.
secret.
First of all, we are getting way off track, and I love where we're going. No, you know what? Let's go
fix
there
Canada.
because I think what you're getting at is before the sector weapon. But what we were getting at is narrative, right? And that's the thing that you were sort of picking up about the idea of people reacting, whether it's to shock doctrine or doppelganger, the sense of story. And something that really stuck out for me from Ta-Nehisi Coates' new book, The Message, is this passage. Yeah, someone was like, Ta-Nehisi? Like, yeah, absolutely. There with you. It's this quote that really stuck with me, and I keep kind of revisiting it over and over. And he said, yes, politics is the art of the possible, but art creates the possible of politics. And I love when a crowd goes, that's my shit. It's great. And what he was getting at is that we subconsciously react to narratives that are already present. We subconsciously react to narratives that are already present, and if we are fed art that sort of substantiates that point, we look to substantiate it in the narratives that we create about policy, about politics, about like the universe that we kind of consume. Which is to say, there is plenty of art made about exploitation of land. There's plenty of art that is made about, like frontiers people who are like, what you do here is like you put an oil rig. I don't know how this is not a great explanation of art that has to do with oil, by the way. And there's like only like How to Blow Up a Pipeline as a movie that is meant to be a counter to any of this. So let's just talk a little bit about why there is such a dearth of narrative that sort of suggests to people how to cope with shocks in these moments. Because in reaction to shocks, most of the art that gets created is actually about the shock itself and how the individual is kind of like at the center of that shock.
Yeah, and I do agree with him. I mean, I think that we're responding to really deeply encoded narratives in this moment. And what I worry most about is that the narrative that we seem to be stuck in is kind of an apocalyptic narrative, right? And it's in all the monotheistic religions. It's like it's the Great Flood, it's the Great Fires, it's the rapture, it's the small group of people that get saved and everybody else gets sacrificed, and that's been in countless Hollywood movies. So I think that there are some people who really believe that this is the moment that we're in, that this is the moment where, there's a lot of Christian Zionists who are in the Trump administration who support Israel because they believe that it's the precursor for the rapture. But I think there's also a kind of a secular rapture going on with the billionaire class who believe that they're fine, they're chosen, they've got their bunkers, they've got their Mars, or the AI singularity or whatever it is. But it's really these stories of abandoning the Earth, right? And this is why I think we actually need stories about like what would happen if we stayed, right? Like what would happen if we decided to all like be okay and save each other, right? And we need and we don't have a lot of stories like that. So I think there's a tremendous role for art. It's why I'm so grateful that Jarrett is here programming at the Chan Center and really thinking about like who are the artists who are trying to trying to bring us other imaginaries, and many of those artists are Indigenous and are bringing Indigenous cosmologies about our interrelation instead of these rupture stories of the chosen few, which are absolutely toxic. But I think we're in that nightmare. I think we're in the dream, and we have to get out of it.
Yeah, and I think that, your point about the need for story and narrative is really well taken, Elamin. We do need it to make sense and to embed a sense of purpose about what we need to do. So my own book is about mobilizing Canada for the climate emergency. I've read a lot of books on climate, and most of them are boring, which is a sin, because the fight of our lives should not be boring. It should be compelling. I remember when I set out to write this book, because I've only ever written one, and I spent, having spent 22 years at a think tank, at a policy research institute, where I wrote and co-wrote lots of policy reports, which were pretty good, but they weren't compelling reading most of the time. So when I set off to write a book, I asked advice of real writers, Naomi and others, and they all had the same answer, which was, if you're going to write a book, you have to have narrative, you have to have a story. And I remember initially struggling with that at the same time as I was doing this research into World War II, which is, became the frame of the book, although it wasn't initially. Originally when I was setting out to write a book, I was going to write a book about how do we mobilize for climate, and what do we do about this gap between what the scientists say we have to do and what our politics seems prepared to entertain. And only one chapter was going to be about World War II. I'm not a historian. I thought I'm going to dig into this story because maybe there's a model there for rapidly retooling the economy. But as I delved into that research, first of all, it started to blow my mind about it was making me look at this material through fresh eyes of, oh, this is what it looks and sounds and feels like to actually be an emergency. But the second thing was, oh my goodness, there's a lot of great story here. Interestingly, there's also and it's not just about retooling the economy, it's about a whole host of things. The role of inequality and Indigenous people and young people, and how do we pay for it, and what do we do for returning soldiers, and how do we marshal public opinion? And so that, I remember turning to my wife, Christine, one night and saying, oh, I think I have to rewrite the whole outline. It's all about World War II. But one section is around the role of art. And part of what was striking was, there is this emerging art around the climate emergency in music and in visual arts and elsewhere, but most of it is apocalyptic. That's not true of the art of World War II. Even though the context was horrific, most of the art rallied us. And I put that to artists when I meet with them over climate stuff. It's like, yes, go ahead and scare the shit out of us. We do need that. But also rally us.
I'm compelled by that idea, the idea that you can build something triumphant in terms of a narrative about the future, because that becomes the thing that is necessary. I'm also conscious of the natural pushback, and anyone in this room can level that against me, go hey man, the world is on fire. You don't need a good story from me. You need action. Why should you need, a motivating kind of story in order to be compelled into realizing this? Does baby need a little story? Is that, why don't you just sort of get with it? And I'm conscious of that. But I'm also conscious of the fact that, Ezra Klein had this column, I think it was February or so, which was just 3 weeks into the Trump administration. And I think the headline of it was, "Don't believe him." And the thesis of that was, hey, Trump is giving you a narrative. He's doing all these things through executive order. He actually can't do that. And in time, the courts are going to say, hey, you can't do that. For the most part, he's been right. Trump has now been finding sort of different ways around that, and that is still sort of a work in progress. But Ezra's larger point reminds me of the Shock Doctrine, in the sense that what Trump is doing is he's giving the narrative that he can do all of these things so that people later believe him. And there is this thing where when you're in the middle of a shock, you kind of go well, he's the president, he can do that, when in fact, he couldn't do that. So what do you make of the power of narrative in the middle of a shock?
Yeah, I think he's throwing a lot at the wall and he knows that not all of it is going to stick, but he's definitely doing some things. And I think the main thing that, he's a pretty simple guy. I think he's motivated by money, always has been, and now he is motivated that, for his whole sort of U.S. class, let's just say. I think, it's possible that I think his interest in Canada, as I said, is I think it's probably less about turning us into the 51st state than sort of using that as an opening bargaining position, and he'll settle for all of our resources and cracking the remaining protections in Canada, including privatizing our healthcare. I mean, these are things that were all on the table and being pushed by the Americans in the original free trade negotiations, right? So they think they can get a better deal. They're going to go for all of it now. But I think that a big part of what I've been thinking about listening to you talking about story is that we are children of neoliberalism. Which was there is no alternative, right? As Margaret Thatcher famously said. And I think that this has been the most lasting part of the neoliberal project. There's very few people out there who will make an ideological argument the way Milton Friedman did, that things are going to be great when we privatize and deregulate. They don't even bother telling people it's going to be good anymore. But the part of the project that was there is nothing but this, that this is, as Francis Fukuyama said, history has ended. We figured it all out. This is just one model, and we're going to spread it to every corner of the world. We just grew up without practice imagining another way of being. And that's different from our parents' generation. As Seth said, they were builders. But everything that I remember from when I started paying attention to politics was just things being clawed back, cut back, unmade. Not like we can actually do this thing. And that's, I think, what's really subversive about what Seth has done with the Second World War, because there are so many World War II movies. This is the most narrativized, event, right? And it's everyone's proud of it, and this is it's really encoded in us. And so to take that storytelling and say, actually, it shows the possible, right? Because I find, I teach climate emergence, a course called Climate Emergency here at UBC. And I've always found that the biggest challenge is not telling people that there's a problem. It's believing we can do anything about it, right? And there is one thing about Trump that I appreciate, which is he has just thrown everything up in the air, right? And so if what he is doing is possible, all kinds of things are possible, right?
But he's certainly testing on a bunch of fronts. But to your point about Ezra Klein's column, I remember seeing that too. I hope he's right, but I'm worried he's not. It's true that Trump may not be legally allowed to do a lot of what he's doing. Doesn't mean he's not prepared to proceed. When after the election, because I'm a glutton for punishment, I decided to go and read In the Garden of Beasts, this book about the first year of Hitler's regime. And of course, he was elected, and this ties into the Shock Doctrine thesis. He seized upon a crisis, the burning of the Reichstag, and declared martial law. And
also one assassination.
That's right. But anything's possible, and we should be alive to how these moments, either coincidental or designed, may be seized upon, including here. I mean, the fact that we're in an election where one of the candidates for prime minister is talking about using the notwithstanding clause is alarming. That's never happened before. And similarly, watching Polyev over the last year, 2 years, and watching some of his rallies online, in some of the ones I watched, the most popular slogan was not axe the tax. It was defund the CBC. And we're not hearing about it now because he doesn't want to invite the parallels to Trump. But there was a desire to take one of the few reliable sources of information off the table and replace it with the information that they control and want. So, yeah, there's reasons for us to be alive to all of these threats.
I mean, the other thing I would just say about our own domestic threats is that it's important for us to understand that what is happening in the U.S. is not just happening in the U.S. There is a global fascist surge, and they are networked, right? I mean, you look at the parade of people coming to Mar-a-Lago, right? And you know, and they, like, game recognizes game. Like, they're getting pointers from each other. What did you do in Hungary? What did you do in Israel? What did you do in Italy? How did that work for you? They're trading worst practices globally. Polyev is part of that network. He is part of that. There are similarities in the stories that they're all telling and the conspiracies that they're spreading. And so, you know, I just think that we have to understand, like, we can't be parochial about any of this. We have to understand these ideas are spreading across borders. They're spreading on information channels that don't respect national boundaries, and Canada's part of this story. And you know, this is why, I mean, one of the things that I like about living in Canada is that we aren't a two-party duopoly. Unfortunately, we're acting like we are one. And you know, I think that we need to make sure that we're not in a position come Tuesday that, you know, we could see, you know, either, you know, I'm very afraid of Polyev, and you know, but I'm also worried of a situation where it seems like we're fighting the U.S., but we're actually imitating the U.S., whether it's on border policy or economic policy, because we're seeing this even from center-left governments in Europe. We're seeing it to a degree from Starmer. So you know, it is a kind of a pro-corporate centrism that created a context for this fascist global surge, where people feel that the system is rigged against them. And this is what I wrote about in Doppelganger, and this is what conspiracy culture taps into, a feeling like, okay, like, elites are plotting against us. Like, you know, we're all getting screwed. Maybe it's all being plotted in a room in Davos, right? You know, maybe it's just all about the UN or whatever the story is. But like I say, they get the facts wrong, but they get the feelings right. And the feeling is being screwed over, left behind, and they're not wrong, right? This is why we can't fight their oligarchs with our oligarchs who have rigged this economy, whether it's the grocery store chains or, you know, like the 3 companies that dominate every single sector. People feel that, and it is ruining their ability to stay in their homes. You know, the cost of living crisis is real, and it is just because that you know, we're focused on Trump, that doesn't go away either. And so if we try to fight it by ignoring all of these other crises, then we may delay it, but we're going to end up with it, because this is the pattern we're seeing globally. So we really have to be an alternative if we want to avoid this fate.
I think there's of course. First, there's a maybe a fantasy, a narrative that the Conservatives are dropping in the polls in this election. They are not. They're sort of holding steady or growing in terms of where they were from the last election, and they've been for the last few months. What's actually happened, and has been sort of the narrative running through this campaign, is a lot of the NDP's support has gone to the Liberals, right? So like that's really the significant shift that has shifted here. The Conservatives have kind of held, for the most part, around 37, 38, gone up a point, gone down a point, depending on which poll you look at. It's surprising to me to see in this moment, especially when the narrative is about the cost of living crises, all of them layered on top of each other, to see this moment, that narrative be seized upon only by the Conservatives and to a much lesser degree by the NDP being able to connect to this. And so just in that larger context, I wonder if either of you have any thoughts about the way that this campaign has kind of played out and how maybe the left has kind of relinquished some of the conversational space around this. Or both of you, you know?
I mean, at one level, I don't think it's surprising that people have gravitated and consolidated around the one figure who they felt could both stave off a Polyev win and respond to Trump. That there's something natural to that. And yet, it's also perplexing. Like, you would think that, I mean, look, on a host of things, I would say Mark Carney's to the right of Trudeau. So you would think in that context that the sort of, for years, the NDP's been competing with the Liberals for the progressive vote. And as that has been, that terrain has been ceded, you'd think that that would be great for the NDP. And yet that's not happening. And I think it speaks to a critique. It's the flip side of what Naomi just said of our progressive electoral leadership across the board, which is incremental. We do face these real crises: climate, cost of living, housing, poison drugs, healthcare. Incrementalism is no match for these crises. As long as the policy response on the progressive side is incremental responses, we will never get ahead of the curve. And we cannot point to substantial enough wins and progress on those key files. And consequently, we're forever under-delivering and forever handing fodder to the far right to say, you see, it's all broken. I mean, this is the incredible strength it's always been of the neoliberal project, is to capitalize on the very conditions it creates, you know, to rage farm from the fallout of their own policies. But we've got to own some of that on the progressive side of the ledger, that we have failed to offer that more compelling alternative, although that's not universally true of individual candidates, I would say. Because when individual candidates do seem to be offering that more compelling alternative, all kinds of excitement gravitates to them. I think that's kind of what's been happening with Naomi's husband in Vancouver Centre. I think it's also, I know I'm biased, but I would say it was true of my wife's political campaigns, where even when a progressive vote is going down overall, it's not, there are individual exciting candidates who still tell their own story at the local level.
What I like is asking two people who are married to NDP people and going, hey guys, what's going on? And you guys are like, well, listen, buddy. But
Ask me after the election.
But let me ask you this.
It tells you that we both married people with better people skills than we have.
You guys think I'm going to move off this? No chance. No. But here's where I want to get to is political imagination, and maybe sort of like spend a bit of time talking about this, because there was a time not that long ago in this country where there was a crisis and governments acted fast. So, you know, March 16th, Trudeau declares the country for the most part closed. April 6th, they announced CERB. By April 20th, checks start landing in people's accounts. That's how fast government could move. We didn't know that that's how fast government could move. Yeah. We just didn't. Like that's new information to me, and I feel like it's new information to a lot of people. The idea that suddenly the machinery of government that we are so used to saying, like, whoa, you want to design a program that does what? Okay, this is going to take maybe 8 years. It'll have to be studied a lot. You know, in the middle of that, you get 3 different governments. Some of them are going to throw it out. Some of them will pick it back up again. And then suddenly, in the face of a crisis that we can all see is a crisis, something kind of magical happens. For just a moment, something kind of magical happens, which is to say, okay, $2,000 a month in every single person who applies for this program. 9 million Canadians apply for that program. And it actually ends up being this thing that actually functions, that actually gets money out the door that quickly. That to me, the fact that like we are not asking our governments to do CERB but for housing, CERB but for every other crisis that's in front of us, that's a failure of political imagination. That's a failure of political imagination because we now know governments can move that fast. How do you build the will for people to say, actually, you can ask more of your government and you can do that right now? How do you do that?
Yeah, it's such a good example, and I think it really relates to your question about narrative, because I don't think we do it policy by policy. I think it's a story about how we're going to change as a society to meet these crises that we're all afraid about, whether it's front of news or taking a backseat to another crisis. Like these are shocking times. I mean, this is what's really different in talking about the shock doctrine. I mean, that was like the shocks came, once a decade, like major shock. I mean, now it's just staccato, right? And so we're meeting this crisis very worn down from COVID, worn down from wildfires, worn down from the cost of living crisis. So I think it's really about a really grand narrative that this work is big, but it can be beautiful, right? I mean, this is what I'm saying about, like, what if we stayed? Like, what if we committed to each other and to this beautiful place where we live, and took care of each other? I mean, that's, to me, what was most remarkable during COVID was less the cutting of the checks and more those moments that are now sort of like sneered about. Oh, remember when people like clapped for nurses, right? Or that stage of the pandemic. But like that was really something, right? I was still living in the U.S. at the first stage of the pandemic, and it was kind of remarkable to be in the heart of capitalism, and part of an economy that so studiously avoids seeing working class people. Thinking about, the promise of the frictionless world is like stuff just magically appears. Like, I just thought about this and a box appeared, and it's like, wait a minute, who packed the box? What could they call in sick? Do nurses have PPE? Are they paid a living wage? What is going on in slaughterhouses?
We call them essential workers.
What are happening in prisons? Yeah, it was like, COVID was like this X-ray. And it showed us that we were connected to each other. The lie at the heart of capitalism: you're an atomized individual. No, we're part of a network. We're part of an ecology, right? And there's nothing like an airborne virus to light that up, right? We're porous to one another. And there was so much desire to show up for each other, not just in a cutting the check ways, but you think about all of the mutual aid networks, people checking in on neighbors, and people, but those types of collective responses to COVID didn't get turned into policy. And Seth has pointed this out. It was the individual responses. You can stay home, we'll send you a check. But, some of my research, like he's the World War II expert, but I've spent a lot of time looking at New Deal policies. And, that was another shock, right? But in the US, it built the social safety net, right? And you think about programs like the WPA, or programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, 2 million people planting 2 billion trees, right? We didn't have anything like that during COVID. It was it reinscribed individualism. What if we'd kept our kids safe by having class size, hiring thousands and thousands of EAs, the most undervalued people in our education system, right? Having more outdoor ed, right? What if we'd done like what Seth, the Climate Emergency Unit, has been calling for, like a climate conservation corps? Like everything we did kept even though we saw that our government could cut a lot of checks, we didn't see our government building new programs in a real way.
Yeah, I want to build on that. And I think, Elamin, your point about imagination cuts to the heart of this. So I feel like I've spent the last few years just studying emergencies. World War II, COVID, climate, of course. Now we have the current emergency. Two things stand out to me in the study of emergencies. The first is, all emergencies start with a period of denial. We all spend the first little bit in a period of denial. That's true of every emergency I just mentioned. The second, though, is that once some sort of alchemy occurs, this combination of leadership and events that shifts the zeitgeist and moves us into emergency mode and then becomes transformative. But often we forget in between. I mean, it's interesting, when Naomi read the first draft of my book, she said, oh, you know what you've done here? You've excavated our imagination from 80 years ago, because we forget. I'm struck when I think about that first year of the pandemic. So let me take a step back. If you had said to Canadians in 1939, this gang in Mackenzie King's cabinet, do they have what it takes to completely transform the Canadian economy and society, as was about to happen? I'm quite certain most Canadians would have said no. And they would have had no reason to believe otherwise, because the same gang had done mostly nothing through the Depression. We didn't have a New Deal like they had in the US. But then it turns out they would have been wrong. And if you had said to me a few months before March 2020, are there people at Finance Canada and the Bank of Canada capable of pivoting in the space of a few weeks and creating these audacious new programs like the CERB and the wage subsidy? I very cynically would have said to you, no, there aren't people there who have that imagination. And it turns out I would have been wrong, because they were there. But, as Naomi says, they were very fast at cutting checks, but not creating institutions. So they did a lot of things right in those early months of the pandemic, but they missed a few important things. They didn't bring in an excess profits tax like we had in World War II, right? The kind of profiteering that has marked the last few years was illegal in the Second World War. But they also didn't recreate a crown corporation to mass produce vaccines. And I say recreate because we used to have a crown corporation that made vaccines, and then Mulroney privatized it. And so instead, what did we do? We used our economic might as a first world country to outbid poorer countries to secure the vaccine that we needed, which is precisely the opposite of what we did in World War II. In World War II, we created 28 crown enterprises and became the arsenal for our allies. The reverse.
But the most shameful thing we did in World War II is fortress our borders to refugees in need. And we run the risk of doing the same thing right now, because we're already seeing a further fortressing of Canadian borders in response to Trump.
Yeah, but I just want to say this last point about imagination. I've spent the last few years with the Climate Emergency Unit, which lives in the David Suzuki Institute. I think David's here. Hi, David. Thank you for the home. And as part of that, we have our public campaigns, like the campaign for Youth Climate Corps. But a lot of the work are these private conversations with political leaders, federal, provincial, from different political parties. And what strikes me the most in these conversations is that for the most part, they get climate. They're not captured. They're not bad people. They're not up to no good. Sometimes they're all of those things, but mostly they're not. What most strikes me again and again is the failure of imagination. I remember campaigning on the Youth Climate Corps and having a conversation with a senior person in the Ministry of Finance. And I was pitching him on the Youth Climate Corps, and he gets climate, and he could get it. And then at one point, he stops me and he says, I get it. I can see the benefit of this. It's not clear to me who we would send a check to. And I was like, no, you don't get it. You have to create the program. You hire the young people. This is going to be a transformative national program, and you have to lead. But the conversation always has to get over that hump. I mean,
they're all products of neoliberalism
exactly.
as well. They
Okay.
all grew up in this.
Sorry. Then I'll shut up. But so one of my mentors is this guy Alex Himmelfarb, who was for a brief time the clerk of the Privy Council, the only left-wing clerk we've ever had. And Alex has this line I find I fall back to all the time. He says, the most insidious legacy of 40 years of neoliberalism, imagine a clerk of the Privy Council even uttering those words, the most insidious legacy of 40 years of neoliberalism isn't the tax cuts or the spending cuts or the privatization or the deregulation. It's the sapping of our imagination and of our faith and our capacity to do great things together.
You hear that? Crowd going, Two things. One, I want to give Mimi a chance to come and bring the iPad. Wow, Mimi was ready with it. That's wild. And I'll close my final question before we turn to these questions here. And it's a question about optimism, and I don't want it to be a forced sense of hope. That's not what I'm looking for. What I'm looking for is where each of you turns to say, what's happening here, if it got a little louder, if you had a little bit more space, then I think that's the world heading in the direction that I want it to go in. And I don't know which of you would like to start. I feel like you gestured to Seth. I feel like maybe.
I want to just pass me that.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, you want to make a pitch for this?
Yeah, I'm going to make a pitch for this. Yeah. Okay. So I feel like this evening has made me feel very old because we have been studying shocks for a long time, both of us. But one thing I can observe, and I don't know if this isn't like a rainbows and puppies hope, but when I first started studying this strategy, we didn't have ideas that were lying around. I mean, we were still, even think tanks like the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, for the most part, were in more of a nostalgic mode of just stop the cuts. We're opposing these attacks on the social safety net, but weren't really proposing a vision that was up to our political moment, that was forward-looking, that wasn't relying on nostalgia. And the biggest shift that I can observe over the past decade is that we have taken our homework seriously of getting our own ideas lying around. Sector by sector, you have bold, forward-looking agendas that everything from abolishing police and defunding and funding mental health and reimagining what security means. I mean, this was not the case when I was writing the Shock Doctrine, that you had a left that was like dreaming so big that people were like, really? But so there's a new think tank in town, the BC Society for Policy Solutions, and they prepared this document just for tonight, ideas to meet the moment, ideas lying around. And they're exciting, and they woven together. It's a vision for another kind of society. And I take a huge amount of heart in the fact that I think we are like a lot of serious work has gone into taking our responsibility to not just say no to their terrible ideas, but to understand, yes, we're in a moment of crisis, profound crisis, intersecting, overlapping, and we have ideas of our own. This is some of the work that we do at the Climate Justice Center. So I think we're readier to go, and we need to fight because everything's on the line, right? No matter who wins tomorrow, and I really hope we dodge the bullet, right? But that is when we start pushing. I hope that they are pushed from the inside and the outside. But that I think what we need to be pushing for, and I don't think it's going to be political parties who are going to come up with the program, and I'm not sure it should be. I think there can be a people's program from below that is pushing our leaders to meet the moment with more of what we want to protect, not less, right? What makes us different.
Thanks for the pitch. There's a ton of these out in the table there, so go get one on your way out. You asked about optimism, and I'm not sure I'm going to give you the answer you want.
Great.
The truth is, most days I'm not very optimistic. I'll tell you a little. So I work with the climate emergency. Some of my teammates at the climate emergency unit are here, and so they know whenever we've had a new person join us at the unit, I have a little speech I give them. I'll tell you what it is. I say, thank you for signing up. It's a bit of a Hail Mary. The path to victory is narrow, and we're probably going to lose. But what else are you going to do except do what you got to do in the company of other really good people? There's a climate scientist in the States named Kate Marvell. That's really her name. I love that. And she says that in this fight for our lives, we don't need optimists. We need heroes. By which she defines people who are courageous and who are prepared to do what needs to be done without the assurance of success. Which is a line that kind of works for me with my weird uncle routine about the World War all the time, because that was true in that story too. Canada was a population of about 11 million people in World War II, and over 1 million of them enlisted. That's mobilization. 64% under the age of 21, which is remarkable. And yet, I like to ask particularly younger audiences, what didn't they know? And of course, what they didn't know is if they would win, which is sort of an obvious thing to say, except we don't think about it because we have the benefit of the rearview mirror and we know how their story ends. But for a large chunk of the war, the outcome was far from certain, and they did it anyway, and surprised themselves in the process. And I just feel like that's the spirit we need today, and for now in this crazy time, it's just going to have to be enough.
Yeah.
I think that is that's a very hopeful answer. I do think that sometimes we tend to think of hope as like a transactional thing. Like if you invest into a cause or a belief, then you get something out of it, and you don't. It's not for you. It's for the next generation to have a slightly larger hope than the one that you had, and it sort of keeps going that way, right? Like you don't necessarily get to, see or reap the benefits of every bit of hope, every bit of action that you have. I think that's a pretty transactional and maybe even selfish way to think about hope. It's not meant to be something that you're like, I've invested this amount of hope, I better get some kind of return out of it. It's like, that's not quite how it works. Okay, let me turn to these questions, because some of these are big, not in number of words, just in like, woof, that's heavy. Let me start with, what are your thoughts on how conservatives were able to garner Gen Z support? Start?
Yeah, well, I'll go. I mean, it is alarming, right? In the space of a few years, the demographics of sort of political voting has been flipped on its head. It used to be the older you were, the more inclined you were to vote conservative. And now the largest base of support for both Trump and Poilievre is specifically young men. At some level, I mean, that's where the rage farming is happening, and they're tapping into an understandable rage about what's been left. I also, though, feel like I have this critique of us in the climate movement for failing to offer a compelling invitation to them. The climate debate is so wonky, so technocratic, it's so often so impenetrable. I mentioned we've had this very active campaign for a youth climate corps, which is doing pretty well, actually. The Youth Climate Corps has found its way into 3-party platforms in this election, so we may actually win it. For the longest time, when I give a lot of talks to younger people, I had this hunch that there were thousands of young people who got the emergency, who wanted to rally again in our collective defense, and are like, where's my goddamn invitation? And so finally, a year and a half ago, I decided, okay, enough of my hunches. We're gonna commission a poll from Abacus. So they're the leading firm, and we did a national poll on the Youth Climate Corps, and we put this quick description of it: 2-year program. You can enlist. You'll get trained up in work that might be a career in emergency response to fires and floods and heat domes, or shoring up community ecological resilience, or driving down our emissions through building retrofits and renewable energy and that kind of thing. And we asked Canadians in the poll, what do you think? Everyone thinks it's a good idea. So much support across every demographic, age, gender, income, region. The second question in the poll only went to people under 35, the group you're asking about. And it said, if a program like this existed, how likely would you be to enroll for 2 years? And they could say, definitely, probably, maybe, or variations of not interested. 65% said they would consider it. 15% said, definitely. Now, there's 9 million Canadians between the ages of 18 and 35, so 15% is 1.3 million young people, once again, over 1 million, saying, I get it, I'm ready. Come on, where's my invitation? And here's the other fascinating thing to me in the poll, because I follow climate polling very closely. It's the only climate poll I've ever seen where the enthusiasm among young men outstrips young women. The very demographic where Trump and Poilievre are finding their base are also like, sounds pretty good.
Phone. Sorry, do you want to take that question too?
Yeah, I will just be very quick because I know we've got lots of questions. I think part of it is that we need to build a more welcoming left. It hasn't been that fun a place to be for lots of good reasons, but also bad ones. And my friend Kianka Yamada-Taylor has been using this phrase. We need to build a welcoming left, like really a place people might want to hang out. I think social media has, we all know the ways it has encouraged our sort of worst impulses, and that's often the way people interact with a political ideology. I also think, one of the things that we know about this sort of manosphere and this iteration of the right is that it's a very grifty culture, very grifty, right? Everyone's like trying to sell you a seminar or a cryptocurrency meme or whatever it is, right? But I think one of the things that I've only started to understand recently is that that is part of the appeal for a lot of young people, and it seems particularly young men, precisely because this economy is so rigged. So it has started to seem like a sucker's game to actually play by the rules and, go to university and, get that job. You're never going to be able to afford a home, but if you kind of gamble and grift, you might actually strike it rich. So I just didn't really understand the appeal of it. And I think that it is really related to the rigging of our economy, and yet another reason why we need socialism. Yeah.
And to build that movement, sign up for Klein Coin, I believe. It's a new cryptocurrency. Naomi, this is a question for you. Are we more numb or less responsive to some kinds of shock today than when you first wrote Shock Doctrine? Put differently, has any of the shock effect worn off?
That's such a good question. Honestly, I am more concerned with our depletion that I am with our state of shock. Because, like, as I was saying, like, we've been in this sort of staccato period, and it's not going to let up because we actually have unleashed these forces, you know, that we're in the rubble of the success of the project to deregulate capitalism, and that plays out in the forms that we all predicted it would, in the forms of the climate crises and the economic shocks and the wild billionaires in charge of everything. It's all happening, and so where there's going to be more shocks. And so in that sense, I think it is true that shocks get less shocking when they're coming all the time. But I think the effect on our well-being is that we feel very, very worn down. And so part of organizing, I think, is figuring out how do we recharge our batteries, like how do we lift each other's spirits, right? And this is where gathering and art and just the caring for each other and you know, I think the hope that, like, I feel most hopeful when I'm around people who inspire me and who I love, you know? It's contagious. And so I think we need to take seriously building those sorts of recharging spaces into our organizing, because we can't just be in, like, activist mode all the time. So I've been thinking a lot about this with my colleagues at UBC about, like, how do we use this space as a recharge space. This, like, just to praise Jarrett yet again, he's done that, you know, with incredible programming and the Come Towards the Fire Festival. You know, this is part of what we need to do. Yeah.
Seth, this question is for you. How can we effectively communicate the craziness of expanding pipelines to those who may see it as a class war and feel ignored in their economic struggles?
Well, I mean, I feel like I've given you some arguments specifically about pipelines, but the missing piece in the climate fight has been we have yet to make a compelling counteroffer to all of those who feel like their economic security is tied into the fossil fuel economy. So that's why with the Climate Emergency Unit, we have made the Youth Climate Corps a keystone campaign, because we feel like it's one piece of making that offer. We've also tried to seed this idea of a just transition transfer, but that's going to have to, we're only going to win when we wed what we need to do on climate with what we need to do on just transition. And that's going to be true again with this emergency in response to Trump. You know, we have these 6 markers of emergency framework that we use, the 5th marker of which is leave no one behind. And it's the social solidarity marker. All mobilizations require that we make common cause across class and race and gender. And inequality is toxic to social solidarity. It's striking to me, just to be your weird uncle again about the war. So, you know, we had this incredible military mobilization, it's spending money hand over fist like never before on all of this military stuff. And yet, even as we were spending money like nobody's business on all of the military hardware and the military mobilization, that's when we introduced Canada's first major income transfer programs. The family allowance comes in the war. Unemployment insurance comes in the war. This famous Marsh Commission report, Marsh, who would go on to become the head of social work at this university, that lays the whole architecture for the post-war welfare system, is written during the war and offered up to Canadians as a pledge and a promise that the country they will come back to will look different and be more just and more equitable than the one they were leaving behind. That's when the mobilization happens. That's when the recruitment numbers start coming in. The same is true with every mobilization. Until you're also making that pledge and promise that people are going to be looked after, that no one will be left behind, that they'll be treated with dignity, unless you're doing that, you're not going to get everyone on the bus. Which is, by the way, one of the ironies to me in the current response to Trump. Normally, in a mobilization, we increase taxes. Most of the income taxes introduced in World War I, the excess profits tax in World War II, like that's precisely when we increase taxes, is to pay for these mobilizations. And yet we're beginning this mobilization with our political leaders competing over tax cuts. And if that's true, we're going to experience the same whiplash we did in the first year of the pandemic, which is low social solidarity, to that beautiful high point of social solidarity that Naomi described with the pots and the pans at 7 o'clock. And then we pissed it all away in the space of a few months because we didn't bring in, we kept saying we're all in it together, except we weren't. So this time, we have to be serious about it and not allow the profiteering.
One thing that I'm conscious of is that what you guys don't know is there's a clock right in front of me, and we are in the red. And we have been in the red for a while. And somewhere, Jarrett, who's been very generous, hasn't given me a hook yet. I think we're at...
I think he left.
We're at it's like, Jarrett's gone. Jarrett's having a drink. Listen, this clock says we're 23 minutes over. Sorry, Jarrett. Let me end with this. Books can sometimes be ephemeral projects that land and meet the moment, and then the moment passes them by, and you keep the book because the book spoke to you in that moment. But you are both in a position where your books are meeting the moment and are having a conversation with this moment anew. The idea that a book that was written years ago comes back as a necessity, as a guide point, as people say, oh, that book taught me something about this moment right now. What do you think it is about this moment that your book is speaking to? What do you think people are finding in Shock Doctrine right now?
I think it is, if people feel very, very overwhelmed. And that is one of the symptoms of shock, right? Is that you just, and this is Trump's specialty, it's relentless. It doesn't stop, right? Every day there's going to be some new thing that's going to make you gasp, you can't believe it, right? I don't think we're built for this much information, right? So I actually think that there's something, yes, the book lays out the strategy, okay, and says, okay, this is what's happening. That's why you feel that way. So it's orienting. There's a quote, you were reading John Berger earlier. My favorite blurb I ever received was from John Berger about the Shock Doctrine, where he said it made him feel calm, right? And calm, he said, is a form of resistance, precisely because our opponents want us scrambled, right? Not that we want to go to sleep, not like keep calm and carry on kind of, right? But that it allows us to strategize, when we can just slow our, our nervous system down, right? I actually think increasingly just reading does that. That's what it does for me. Like when I step away from a device and I hold a book in my hand and I'm making a commitment to this book, or even, a long article that I can't simultaneously check my email during and reward myself after reading a paragraph and see what's going on. But you're just there and you're saying, I'm going to calm down. I'm going to get slow enough to actually just read this, right? There's something about that slowness that we need.
I love a clap for reading, by the way.
That was for you, Leslie, and the Vancouver Writers Festival. Yeah.
Where to go with your question? Look, we are facing real emergencies. This Trump emergency and the threat of fascism and the climate emergency, which has not gone away. But emergencies are also openings. To quote another great writer, Arundhati Roy, they are a portal that let us leap into the new we've always known we had to do. But it creates that space. And books have story. Like, Naomi was mentioning how this particular story that I locked onto has been so storied, right? There are so many movies and films and books about World War II, this 85-year-old story. And yet still, you can go to any bookshelf in the bookstore, and there's so many of these books. Why is that? And I think, here's what I think is going on with the World War II story that I'm using. I think for all the people who read these books or watch a film, but read the book, and they get to the end of it, and they close it, and they have a question. I don't know if there's World War II buffs in the room, but if there are, you close the book, and there's a question in your head, I bet. And the question is, and it's the kind of question all good stories invite, what would I have done if I had lived then and there? And the answer to that question is, because here we are again, whatever we're each ready to do now.
All right, we're so over time. But just building on that, there's just one idea that I've been playing with, just because I really feel that this idea of chosenness is at the heart of many of the nightmares we're caught inside. This idea that there's one group of people that are better than other people that are going to survive the floods, or have been, and this hierarchy, this ranking of humanity is surging back. It never went away. But it's surging back precisely because we know that we have made large parts of the planet uninhabitable. We know more people are coming. We know. And so the fact that white supremacy is surging in the way that it is, it's a story that allows people to rationalize, right? Letting people drown, letting people, die in horrific circumstances. So I've been thinking, what if we thought of ourselves? But I think the idea of chosenness is very powerful. That's why it's so deep in all of these religions. And so I just wonder what would happen if we really decided that we've all been chosen, to be in this moment where everything is on the line, where what we do or don't do in this handful of years is going to determine the fate of this planet. That's a story, and it's true. It's actually a true story. So yeah, that's the idea I want to leave you with as a possible story. What?
I feel there's one other thing we just have to say.
You want to build on that?
I don't really want to build on that. I just feel like it's like we're in a big political meeting and there's an election in 2 days because we have to say something. Am I wrong about that? And I'm struck. I'm just going to say it. I am so. This is such a weird election that so many people are both so motivated and yet simultaneously uninspired. And I get it. But here's the other thing that I know. We desperately need the next parliament to include true climate and social justice champions. People who are not afraid to bring on the fight with those powerful interests, whether it's the fossil fuel industry or the privatizers or whatever. There are those people out there and running. So, we have to prevent a conservative win, of course. But I just want to say, I feel like I would be remiss not to say, by all means, vote strategically, but do it wisely and attuned to your local context. If you are lucky enough to live in a riding where there is a true champion, try to get them over the line. They may or may not be related to somebody on the stage.
I was like, I don't think I have a cousin running in this election, so. Look, before we go, I just want to say Upstart and Crow are selling books right outside those doors. Today is Canadian Independent Bookstore Day, so support an independent bookseller. Seth, Naomi, thank you so much, you guys.
Thank you so
Thank you. It's
much.
been tremendous. Thanks again.
Thanks, everybody.